Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us for another study of the great chapters of the Bible. This time we're going to be taking a look at Daniel chapter 1. We've taken a look before in a previous study at Daniel chapter 2 regarding Daniel's great prophecy of the wonderful coming kingdom of God. But we're going to be taking a look at what happened before that. This is in Daniel chapter 1, and there's a lot of history that we can cover that leads up to where we find Daniel in Daniel chapter 1. Let's take a look at some of the things that were going on then. When you take a look at this map, you see that the Assyrian Empire was, before Daniel had been taken to Babylon, Assyria was the big dog on the block. They were the world power. And about 612 BC, Babylon, led by Nabopolassar, along with a Mede named Cyaxares, began to overthrow a severely weakened Assyrian empire that had been the major source of power for centuries, on and off. Pharaoh Necho of Egypt was at war with Assyria during the Medes and the Babylonians' conflict with Assyria. And Pharaoh had marched through Palestine northward and killed Judah's king Josiah as he went out in an attempt to stop the Assyrians. And he engaged in battle with them at Carchemish. Necho continued his quest, and he made it as far as Carchemish when the Babylonians and the Medes had defeated Nineveh. Nineveh was the seat of Assyrian power. You see it over there in the middle of the purple. They're about the middle of the map here. Well, after defeating the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, Nabopolassar entrusted the command of his army to his son Nebuchadnezzar, and immediately Nebuchadnezzar began a march on Egypt at Carchemish, and he defeated the Egyptians. And of course, during the march that the Babylonians would continue to make, they would just expand their empire. You see here where they not only were an empire in their own right, but they took all that had belonged to the Assyrians and just enlarged it. Well, after they had beat up the Assyrians at Nineveh, Nebuchadnezzar marched over to Carchemish, where he drove back the Egyptians. And all of this was foretold by the prophet Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 46 and verse 2, Jeremiah tells Egypt concerning the army of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, which was by the Euphrates River at Carchemish, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, defeated in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. Well, Nebuchadnezzar pursued the Egyptians all the way south, back through Syria and Palestine, and during that time, Josiah's son got caught up in all of this. Jehoiakim ended up being a vassal king. He was completely controlled by by the Babylonians. This was in 605 BC. And what happened was that during that time, as he was going to head back to his kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar not only took a bunch of the treasures of the temple with him, but he also took a bunch of Jewish people with him. Among them were young people. Daniel was one of those young people. And this is actually not just Bible history, it's secular history. This is one of the tablets of the Babylonian Chronicle. As you can see here, it's a series of clay tablets that recorded the deeds of the kings of Babylon. And this particular tablet, although I can't read ancient Babylonian, but it includes the exploits of Nebuchadnezzar as he takes Jerusalem. This records the events that occurred in 597 BC. Well, about 100 years before this, Isaiah had foretold to King Hezekiah that some of the king's own offspring would be taken to Babylon, along with much of Judah's wealth. That's in 2 Kings 20 in verses 16 through 18. Jeremiah, another prophet, had prophesied that the nation would fall to Babylon. That's in Jeremiah 20 verse 4, and would serve the foreign nation for 70 years. That's in Jeremiah 25 verses 1 through 14. The prophet Habakkuk questioned why God would allow such a wicked nation to come in judgment against Judah. And God told him in the book of Habakkuk, don't worry about it, I'm doing what I need to do. And eventually Babylon will get theirs in the end, but it's coming. And so Habakkuk, when you read that book, he just resigns himself to God's will, knowing that eventually it's going to happen. Well, Jerusalem finally fell in 586 BC, and along with it, the temple and the town, the city walls were destroyed, reduced to rubble in many cases. Here's some important dates that are important for us to keep in mind. In 612, Nineveh fell, and with it, the Assyrian Empire. The Babylonians took over. In 605 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar had marched on over to Carchemish to defeat the Egyptians, he chased them down south to Egypt, and Israel got caught in the middle of it. Judah got caught in the middle of all that. And it was during that time in 605 BC that the first wave of Hebrews were taken to Babylon, among them Daniel. In 597 BC, the second wave of Hebrews was taken. Finally, in 586 BC, the fall of Jerusalem comes, and that's when the final wave of Hebrews were taken off into Babylonian captivity. In 536 BC, Babylon falls, and Cyrus the Persian allows the Jews to return. And that's at the end of 2 Chronicles, and you find where Cyrus the Persian in Daniel chapter 5 takes Babylon without even it seems, any bloodshed. Well, if Daniel was taken captive in his early teens or maybe even late teens, then Daniel and his friends, we're going to meet them in a moment, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they would have had the privilege of growing up under some great kings. Well, not really, right? Josiah was the last one who was to institute any reforms, but they had gone the way of idolatry after that. And they would have also had the greater privilege of living under some wonderful prophets. You see among them Zephaniah, Nahum, Jeremiah, Habakkuk, and then later Ezekiel. They would have been able to hear these prophets tell the people that unless they repented, they were going to have to suffer terrible, terrible consequences. And of course, those consequences came in 586 BC. Now, not a lot is known about Daniel's life before he got to Babylon. It's indicated to us perhaps in Daniel 1 and verse 3 that maybe he was among those who were offspring of the king. We had spoken before where the prophet had foretold to King Hezekiah that some of his own offspring, some of his descendants would be taken captive to Babylon. But we know this. Daniel was a firm believer in the God of Israel. In fact, his own name reflects that. Daniel's name means God is judge, or one who is judged by God. And he demonstrates this faith from his youth all the way to his old age. And we see the span of Daniel, the book of Daniel, spanning some 70 years, where Daniel goes from a very young man, maybe not more than a kid, to an old man. And throughout all of that, of course, they were in for some major changes. Not only would they experience a change in location from Judah to Babylon, they would experience a change in culture, a change in language, even a change in their names. And it's important for us to realize that as they underwent this change of identity, the one thing that would not change would be God. He would still be there. No matter where the there was, he would still be the one guiding the events. And he would still be the one who loved his people, although they needed to be disciplined for their flagrant disregard of his law. And that's one of the reasons why Daniel shines. He's one of those few who recognize that although I've got to be caught up in this punishment of my people, still I will not stop serving God. He knew that God was there. And there are hints to us of God being there throughout the book of Daniel. In verse 2, it says that the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. In verse 9, it tells us that God granted Daniel favor and compassion. In verse 17, we're told that God gave these 4 youths knowledge and intelligence. So God is there. He's directing things, and he's got a very active hand in what's going on. And that tells us something about the way things go sometimes. I've titled this first section, Man Proposes, but God Disposes. And that's what we see. We see that in spite of man's plans, God's plans are often very different from ours. Let's read the first couple verses of Daniel chapter 1. In Daniel 1 and in verse 1, it says, In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Now the book starts simply by telling us that Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Judah. And this was, it tells us, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, which would have been 605 BC. Now, Jerusalem didn't fall completely at that time. Nebuchadnezzar returned twice more, once in 597 and again in 586 BC, when the city finally fell. The temple was burned, the city and its walls were destroyed. But this shouldn't have been a surprise to Judah, since God had warned them repeatedly that he was going to punish their sin. Finally, God had enough, and Judah fell. It said Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. He weakened them terribly during that first trip, and there would be a time when God had just finally had enough. In fact, let's just take a look at the second book of Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Some sad words we're going to read from 2 Chronicles chapter 36. We're going to begin in verse 15. 2 Chronicles 36 and in verse 15. We read, Yahweh, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of Yahweh rose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or infirm. He gave them all into his hand. All the articles of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of Yahweh, and the treasures of the king and of his officers, who brought them all to Babylon. Then they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its fortified buildings with fire, and destroyed all its valuable articles. Those who would escape from the sword he carried away to Babylon. And there were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it kept Sabbath, until 70 years were complete. And those 70 years are chronicled for us in the book of Daniel, and the things that we see going on in Daniel's life, in the book of Daniel. But I want you to notice that even though Daniel 1:1 tells us that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, this was all because of God's doing, just as we read in 2 Chronicles 36. If we go back to Daniel 1 and look at verse 2, it says that the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And so from the very beginning of the book of Daniel, the book reminds us that although humans are involved in the activities, God is the one behind the events. It's the Lord who gave Jerusalem into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. In Leviticus 26, we're not going to turn there, but in Leviticus 26, God had spelled out the blessings and the curses of the covenant, and he had threatened them that if Israel continued to rebel, now this is in Leviticus, this is before they even got into the land, but that if they continued to rebel, he would scatter them among the nations and leave them to rot in their enemies' lands. Now you figure that was foretold back in the time when Israel was in the wilderness, receiving the law of God. And it tells us something about the patience of God and how much it must have grieved God to finally have to deliver his punishment to Israel. But true to his word, that's exactly what he did. The predictions that we find leading up to the fall of Jerusalem, well, they find their fulfillment in that fall. We find, as we continue on in Daniel chapter 1, some details concerning Daniel's deportation. Read with me in verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom were no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, and at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. To Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, notice with me that Ashpenaz, the king's official, was supposed to handpick certain nobility, certain youths of the nobility from Israel. And he was looking for certain qualities among them. They were to be attractive and intelligent, with an aptitude for advanced learning, because they were about to be indoctrinated for 3 years. Finally, after that 3 years, having learned all that they should know about the Chaldean culture, the Chaldean ways of doing things, probably as well as the gods that they worshipped, they would be introduced into service in the king's court. And further, they would enjoy a diet of the king's best food. The version that I'm reading from calls it the king's choice food. If you've got the old King James version, they're called the king's dainties. I like that. It tells us something about the quality of the food and what they could enjoy if they just handled things right, if they just did what the Babylonians wanted them to do. And so the stage is set for Daniel and his friends' first test of devotion to Yahweh. And the reprogramming commenced by the renaming of these youths. And this is important because there is something in a name. For instance, Daniel means God judges. His name is changed to Belteshazzar, which means Bel, protect his life. Now Bel was one of the gods of the Babylonians. Hananiah, his name means Yah, or Yahweh is gracious. Shadrach, the Babylonian name they gave him, means at the command of Aku. Aku was, again, one of the Babylonian gods. Mishael, his name means who is what God is. Now his name doesn't change much, but it's enough. It was changed to Meshach, which means who is what Aku is. Again, a reference to the Babylonian god. Azariah, his name means Yah will help. It was changed to Abednego, meaning servant of Nego. Nego was, again, a Babylonian god. And so we see how these names change from honoring the God of heaven to honoring the idols of the Babylonians in whose land they're now living. It's interesting to me, though, that although we read repeatedly from here on out about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego instead of the names Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, usually we read of Daniel. Very rarely is he referred to as Belteshazzar, although it does happen from time to time, but usually he's referred to as Daniel. And of course we should make no mistake, although in a later study we're going to take a look at Daniel chapter 3, where Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, figure prominently in that story in Daniel 3. This really is Daniel's story from beginning to end. The opportunities Daniel has to stand fast for his faith in God while still receiving the favor and respect of his captors. Well, let's talk about this food for a moment. It says that the king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food. We find that in verse 5. Let's continue reading in verse 8. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food, or with the wine which he drank, so he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials, and the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your face looking more haggard than the youths who are at your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Please, test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter, and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were given to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. And we'll stop there for just a moment. Let's understand something about this choice food, because that's what it keeps calling it. Choice food, choice food, choice food. We mentioned before about the quality of the food, but this is something that the king himself enjoyed. Now, the king was able to enjoy the best of everything, and he was willing to share with these captured youths the best that he enjoyed. Maybe in order to convince them that if you serve me right, this is how you get to eat for the rest of your days. The point of this is that this was something that was going to be very hard for most people to refuse. So why did Daniel refuse such good food, such choice food, the king's dainties? Well, for a couple of reasons, probably. The implication to us is that somehow this food was mostly against the dietary laws that Moses had delivered. And if we're discovering one thing about Daniel, it's that he had respect for God, and hand in hand with that means that he had respect for God's law. And in addition, it's probable that the meat and the wine, the food that they were given to eat, had probably previously been offered in sacrifice to one of the gods of Babylon, and then served to those who were at the king's table. First, it was given so that the false gods would bless it, and then given to the king and his court to eat. And of course, for food that had been tainted with religious error, well, that just wouldn't do for Daniel. And so he made up his mind, it tells us. And he made up his mind in spite of several things. He made up his mind in spite of risking insult to the king. After all, the king is allowing them to share in what comes off of his own table. He made up his mind in spite of possible pressures from his peers. Don't forget that there were other Hebrew youths who were willing, who were probably eager to partake of the good stuff from the king's table. And Daniel and his three friends are saying, nope, not for us, please. We'll just have, it tells us vegetables, just vegetables. And he made up his mind, in spite of risking opportunity for advancement, along with risking insult to the king, singling themselves out from the rest of their peers. They might have been thought of as troublemakers. We're going to find out in a moment that that's not so. But all this has the potential for disaster for Daniel and his friends. But Daniel convinced Ashpenaz to let him and his friends eat their own choice of food, and to be tested after 10 days to see if the diet was working. And at the end of the trial period, well, Daniel and his friends had flourished physically. It tells us they were fatter than any of the rest. It doesn't mean that they were getting flabby. It meant that they were healthy. There was a glow of health to them. And it turns out that this 10-day test would be allowed to become a permanent menu for Daniel and his friends. But I want you to notice something else. We see here that Daniel made up his mind in spite of some risks that could come to him and his friends. But Daniel made up his mind, and I want us to see how Daniel made up his mind. Daniel made up his mind with politeness. I'm sorry, you're going to have to ignore that mistake I've got there, where it says in spite of. No, it wasn't in spite of. It was with politeness that Daniel made up his mind. There in verse 8, it tells us that he simply spoke. He sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. He didn't make any demands. He wasn't being difficult. But with respect for those who had authority over him, he made up his mind to be as reasonable with them as he possibly could. And he made up his mind with God's help. There in verse 9 it tells us again that God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander and of the officials. And that's the same kind of wording that we find regarding Joseph many generations earlier. When Joseph had been in prison in Genesis chapter 39, it tells us that God granted favor to Joseph among his captors. And we find the same thing going on here. A different captive, a different time, but the same favor that God allows him to have among his captors. There's a pertinent passage from 2 Chronicles 16 verse 9. 2 Chronicles 16 verse 9 says that the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, so that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. Let me read it again. The eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. Not only was Daniel granted favor in the sight of the commander of the officials, Daniel had favor with God. God saw this young man willing to stand up for what he knew was right instead of taking the easy way. God helped him. Daniel made up his mind with persistence. In verses 10 through 12, it tells us of Daniel not taking no for an answer. He didn't give up after the first refusal. Probably anybody else would have. I mean, after all, he was a captive. And it would have been easy for them to take him out of the lineup of those selected youths and just tossed back with the regular inhabitants of those who had been taken captive, or maybe even thrown into prison for refusing a direct order of the king. But instead, he tried something else, and he went to the official over the official. And it worked, right? Because Daniel made up his mind with a willingness to test his faith. He was confident enough in God to know that his way was the right way. And even though it didn't seem right to anybody else, Daniel knew that I believe God. And if God says this is the best kind of food for me, then I'm going to go with God. And he was willing to test his faith not only before God, but to test his resoluteness and steadfastness to God in front of his captors and also his peers. Don't forget that there were other Hebrews looking on to see what Daniel would do. He was willing to lay everything on the line because of his faith in God. And what ends up happening for Daniel? Well, let's read about it. Verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days, which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. Now, let's take a look at this. It tells us that these young men had found favor with God, whom they already had favor with, but also with man. It says that God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of wisdom, in every branch of literature. And it says Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. And Daniel's going to get a reputation for being a dream interpreter. We had looked at that in a previous study of a great chapter, another one in Daniel 2, where he had interpreted a dream that the king had had concerning a statue. Daniel would get a reputation because he understood correctly all kinds of visions and dreams. And when the time had come for them to be presented before the king, they were the most outstanding of all those who had been groomed for the position. It tells us, as for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them. And don't forget, it told us in verse 19 that the king had talked with them. He took some time to interview these guys. And it says he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. So let's step back for a moment and just look at what we're finding in Daniel chapter 1. At the beginning of the story, we find these captives who had been subjugated, who had been taken to another place against their will for sure. But at the end of this chapter, we find these very captives at the head of the royal court. From Judah's shameful defeat to Daniel and his friends' victory, he served next to the throne. And he did this, verse 21 tells us, for the next 70 years until the first year of Cyrus the king. Now, this chapter is great for several reasons. Some of those we've already looked at. But there are a lot of other lessons that we can easily draw from this chapter. One is the need for commitment to the Lord at a young age. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 reminds us that we need to be faithful to the Lord from our youth. It tells us about the need to remain steadfast, especially in difficult circumstances. Daniel could have been like any other of his peers, not including the other three friends that we had read about, but like those others who had caved into assimilating themselves into Babylonian culture. And Daniel stands out as a bright, shining light of perseverance and faithfulness to God. And of course, we're reminded also of the need to remember that God doesn't abandon us just because things are hard. It's an opportunity for us to show faith and steadfastness and even greater reliance on God. Yeah, this is one of the great chapters of the Bible. And it's usually one that we just kind of get through quickly so we can get on to Daniel chapter 2 or Daniel chapter 3. But I hope you can see that this chapter stands as one of the great ones in its own right. Well, thanks for joining me today. Hope to see you again. God bless you.